Вітаю! Мене звати Інна Борзило, і це міжнародний форум «Демократія в дії. Конференція нульової корупції». Це найперша розмова такого рівня, яка відбувається в Києві, і присвячення гібридним викликам демократії, від яких зараз потерпає, на жаль, не лише Європа, не лише Америка, не лише Україна, весь світ стикнувся з ними. Мова йде про системну корупцію, дезінформацію та правові війни. Наш форум працюватиме 2 дні – 7 та 8 червня. До нас приєднається більше ніж 70 спікерів з різних країн. Ми очікуємо участь президента України Володимира Зеленського, президентки Молдови Маї Санду, віце-президентки Єврокомісії з питань цінностей та прозорості Вєри Юрової, президента Венеційської комісії Джанні Букікіо, заступника генерального директора НАТО Мірча Джоани, багато інших очільників антикорупційних органів, міністерства, громадських діячів, дослідників, які по всьому світі сьогодні намагаються знайти відповідь на виклики демократії. Вже зараз до нас приєдналися, зареєструвалися і стежать за цим форумом більш ніж 700 учасників з 40 країн світу. Це шалений інтерес, він лише підкреслює актуальність нашої теми. Ми сподіваємось, що Україна стане майданчиком для пошуку рішень на ці виклики, адже вже більше 5 років ми попереду багатьох країн і успішно відбиваємо такі атаки на нашу демократію. Дуже прикметно, що цю зустріч найвищого рівня організували, ініціювали представники громадянського суспільства. Це громадські організації «Центр протидії корупції», мережа захисту національних інтересів АНЦ, Центр «Нова Європа» та багато інших партнерів, які сьогодні будуть модерувати панелі, будуть робити свої важливі повідомлення і пропозиції. Це і Центр громадських свобод, Інститут масової інформації, ОПОРА, АйФЕС. 2 дні ми працюємо в студії в Києві. Багато гостей до нас будуть приєднуватися онлайн в режимі. Всього це більш ніж 70 спікерів. Ми працюємо з дотриманням карантинних умов, тому все відбувається безпечно, а головне – і інформативно. І наша зустріч має такий глобальний підзаголовок – «Конференція нульової корупції». І саме боротьба з корупцією буде у фокусі нашої розмови. Ми будемо говорити не лише про антикорупційне законодавство України, але і матимемо дискусію про системну корупцію, про олігархів, про транскордонну корупцію і способи боротьби з нею. І саме зараз я готова запросити до слова модераторку першої панелі. Це така парасолькова панель, яка покриє головні аспекти дезінформація, правові війни, які пізніше будуть розкриті детальніше під час вже предметних панелей. Отже, модераторка першої панелі Богдана Депо, радниця депутата Європарламенту.
Дякую. Hello, good evening, good morning, good afternoon. It is a big pleasure and honor for me to be hosting this conference. Hello. It's a pleasure to be moderating this conference. Thank you to organizers for this big honor and for this trust in me. So I flew here from Brussels. I flew here from Brussels, actually, from rainy Brussels to sunny Kiev, to moderate this wonderful panel with the distinguished speakers. So we are the umbrella panel. We are opening up the event. We're going to discuss different aspects that you will hear and discuss in details with other panelists throughout this 2 days of marathon, where we are here to praise the democracy in action. Our panel specifically is about the threats, the hybrid threats to democracy. So here we're going to discuss disinformation, lawfare, and strategic corruption. In this 1 hour, we're going to discuss how hybrid threats work, how can we resist them, and for most, our aim is to find together the solution on this issue. So I would like to start with the video statement by the Acting Assistant Secretary of the United States of America, Philip Reeker. Please.
Hello. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. It really is such an honor to be part of an esteemed panel and to join Senator Coons in pre-recording a message for you. I would like especially to acknowledge my fellow panelist, Jamie Fly. Jamie leads Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, which recently celebrated its 70th year of providing independent news and information, including being at the forefront of efforts to expose corruption and getting objective news to people in places where freedom of expression is restricted to varying degrees. RFE-RL's service in Ukraine is a prime example of these efforts. So in this spirit, I want to take a moment to recognize the incredibly important role that civil society plays in Ukraine and the broader region in strengthening democratic institutions, promoting human rights, advancing necessary reforms, and furthering your country's Euro-Atlantic integration. The work you do is vital, and it takes courage. We know that civil society activists and independent journalists are under threat across the region, whether from disinformation narratives that aim to undermine your work, from malign actors who seek to shake your resolve, or from authorities who seek to silence you through harassment, intimidation, arrests, or prosecution. The United States of America stands with civil society activists and journalists in the region, whose voices drive your communities forward towards a brighter future. As Secretary of State Blinken has said, the fight against corruption is just as crucial to Ukraine's future as its fight against Russian aggression. Ukraine has made commendable progress to cement reforms following the 2014 Revolution of Dignity, which serve as an example for the region and beyond. I was pleased to join Secretary Blinken on his visit to Kyiv in April, my first time back in Ukraine since January 2020, and it inevitably reminds me of my very first visit in May of 1995. And I must commend the progress Ukraine has made in recent years, which includes implementing decentralization policies that will empower citizens at the local level, passing land reform legislation that will unleash Ukraine's vast agricultural potential, and taking steps to reform and modernize Ukraine's prosecutorial service. We hope to see further steps to protect the independence and integrity of Ukraine's justice sector institutions, to ensure international standards of transparency in corporate governance, and pass much-needed legislation to reform law enforcement bodies. We have also seen a wide range of malign actors attempt to undermine reforms to serve not only their own personal financial interests, but broader political agendas. These include pro-Russian and oligarchic interests that spread disinformation and attempt to influence institutions to sway decisions or create chaos. They pose a key strategic challenge for Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic integration. The United States has taken action to sanction or place visa restrictions on corrupt and malign actors who have undermined democratic processes. In March, we publicly designated Ukrainian oligarch Igor Kolomoisky as ineligible for entry to the United States due to his involvement in significant corruption. We welcome steps by the Ukrainian government earlier this year to sanction corrupt actors, and we applaud the work of Ukrainian civil society in exposing corruption. We hope to see further action by the Ukrainian government, including in the courts, to hold these actors accountable in the coming months and years. Countering corruption is a key strategic goal of the United States, globally and in Ukraine. As we have seen in Ukraine, developing strong institutions that can resist corrupt influence is a key to a wide range of broader goals, including creating economic opportunity, protecting human rights and fundamental freedoms, and resisting external aggression. Civil society has a key role to play, and we look forward to continuing to work with you towards a brighter future for Ukraine and for all countries in the region. Thank you for your attention and very best wishes in all that you do to combat corruption.
Thank you very much, dear Ambassador. Indeed, it takes courage to stand up for democracy, and our distinguished panelists are an example for this. I would like to briefly introduce you the speakers. Oliver Bullough is a well-known investigative journalist who is based in London and author to a recent book called Moneyland. Jerzy Pomianowski is the director of the Endowment, European Endowment for Democracy, and Jamie Fly, director of the Radio Free Europe, which was just mentioned by the ambassador. I would like to immediately turn to questions. Oliver, I have a question to you. Ambassador Reeker has just mentioned that corruption and fighting corruption is a core priority of the US government. Can you please explain us a bit? I have recently came across a notion which is strategic corruption. In your publications, you discuss different aspects of corruption. Can you please tell us what does that mean and why it is a risk? Thank you.
Well, I mean, corruption happens in many ways, obviously, and it is as old as there has been power. I'm sure as long as people have had power, there has been corruption. But we need to recognize that corruption as it now exists is a new invention. It is not traditional corruption. This is not the kind of corruption that would have been familiar to people in the Middle Ages. The ability to steal billions of dollars and to hide them in the international financial system, to hide them via shell companies, via offshore bank accounts, and then to invest them in foreign countries at the click of a button is a new phenomenon, which allows corrupt officials, corrupt individuals to steal vastly greater sums of money than have ever been possible in the past. Obviously, it's difficult to assess exactly how much money we're talking about, owing to the fact that this money is very well hidden. But, you know, according to sensible conservative estimates, we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars a year, if not more than $1 trillion a year. And all of that money is flowing out of countries that desperately need it, like Ukraine, and into countries that frankly don't really need it, like Britain. But the important message to take away from this is that corruption is not something that happens within a country. Corruption in its modern form is inherently international or transnational. The money moves between jurisdictions, taking advantage of differences in legislation and differences in regulation in order to hide, for its owners anyway, to be able to hide it from law enforcement in all those countries, which gives corrupt officials an advantage that honest people do not have, because honest people have to act within a single country, whereas corrupt officials can act transnationally. And so, obviously, this is an opportunity for theft, an opportunity for kleptocracy on the grandest possible scale. Obviously, we saw that in Ukraine with the government of Viktor Yanukovych. We continue to see it in Russia with the people around Vladimir Putin, and many other countries suffer likewise. But it isn't just an opportunity for theft, it's also an opportunity to use that money to interfere with politics in foreign countries in order to prevent them from taking action. in order to crack down on the abuse of the international financial system. And it's quite obvious to see why this is happening. If a friend of Vladimir Putin's is using the British property market to stash their illegal wealth, then naturally they have an interest in that property market not being cracked down on, not being well regulated. So they're going to try and interfere in British politics in order to prevent that happening. The same goes, of course, with Ukraine or Moldova or any of the other countries of Eastern Europe that have been part of Russia's sphere of interest in the past, but are no longer. So the international financial system, the shadow financial system that I call Moneyland in my book, is not just a network for wealth, it's also a network for influence, for doing anything secretly and in the shadows. And corrupt actors will fight to defend their financial system, their illegal financial system, at least as strongly as we are currently fighting to defend the legal financial system. That's no surprise. So when we talk about strategic corruption, essentially that's what we mean. We're talking about a sphere, a kind of theft, kleptocracy, which is dependent on an unregulated international financial system. And therefore, in order to maintain that system, the corrupt officials will use their wealth to try and prevent anyone from cracking down on their illegal activities. It's happening everywhere all the time, and to be honest, it's probably growing rather than shrinking. And governments all over the world, from the United States downwards, are not paying this nearly as much attention as they should, though it should be said it is heartening to see the efforts that Joe Biden's administration is putting into thinking about this, which makes a nice change.
Oh, thank you. Interesting. Also, would you classify the Nord Stream as such an example?
Well, yes. I think that there's no doubt that Nord Stream is a tool of Russian state interests, which they are using in order to advance their interests, in order to make money for the elite around Vladimir Putin, which tends to privatize the profits of Gazprom for itself. And this is one of the examples of why strategic corruption is so intractable, because the Russian elite is able to offer the German government something the German government desperately wants, which is reliable energy supplies coming directly to their door. What country wouldn't want that? So it is this ability to control the resources of a state as wealthy as Russia. And obviously Russia isn't the only place that does this, but it's the most pressing for the purposes of this conference. Their ability to use the resources of the state to reward foreigners, to reward foreign decision makers, makes them a very persuasive partner. And it's very difficult to do anything about that, because how can you say to German manufacturers that you're going to cut them off from a reliable source of energy if you're the German government? It's a very difficult issue to address.
Oliver, a slightly different question. We know that Great Britain has a very strong laws on defamation. Oligarchs are hiring lawyers who are actually here to prevent investigative journalists to do your job. So how are you actually working in this type of space?
Well, it's true. Britain does have very strong, strict laws on defamation, which does make journalists' jobs very difficult. I have a good friend called Catherine Belton, who published a very good book about Vladimir Putin, Putin's people, which received excellent reviews in all over the world, actually. She is currently being targeted by 4 different billionaires because of what she wrote about them. And in fact, it's not just the oligarchs have got very good, not just at using defamation laws against journalists, but also using data protection laws, which are created at the European level, and essentially repurposing them to attack journalists with. And this is a very worrying phenomenon, but essentially it's something that oligarchs who have a global view, they can see, look all over the world, they're able to pick which countries are most attractive for them for furthering whatever wishes of which they have to do. So the UK is sadly a very good place to bring defamation proceedings, and this is happening still, despite the fact that the government supposedly solved this a decade ago. It persists, and sadly I don't think it's likely to change.
Thank you. Now a question to Jerzy. The ED was established in 2013, actually, to protect the unprotected. So to say, for example, like journalists like Oliver. And we can agree that our neighborhood, eastern neighborhood, has changed significantly since. Do you see that that the society has become more robust and that the society can actually stand against the new phenomena of hybrid threats?
Thanks, Bogdana. This is a very good question. Thank you also for this invitation. I was dreaming to be in Kiev with you, not in this hybrid format, but still June turns to be too early to go from Brussels to, you are in Brussels actually, but to be in Kiev with others that are now enjoying also the beauty of the city. So hopefully next time we are back to normal, but this time still online. Let me address your question. This is quite important to understand the role of society. But before that, let me make 3 points about what exactly we're talking about. I would focus on 3 elements: hybrid, threats, and society. Hybrid means, because not every threat is hybrid. Hybrid means there is element of intention. There is a state structure behind it. There is someone who deliberately applies certain measures to achieve certain results. Threats to democracies are various. You have populism, you have a lot of, poverty, you have a lot of other issues that are obvious direct threats to democracy that are not intentional, that are just subject of historic situations, trends, as well as consequences of bad governance. And finally, you have a society. Society or organized society or civil society. These are all terms that can be seen today in parallel, because actually the concept of civil society is fading out. Now, I would say we have a whole of the society, because what is important within this whole of the society is that it's organized. And this is definitely something that is changing among Eastern Partnership countries, not just because EED started to work in 2013, but because societies are getting more and more mature, because we have internet, because we have exchange of information, and because society is always fastest to react to threats and changes, because the society see them from the close distance. So let me go back to this element of hybrid, where you have this intention. In case of Ukraine, in case of countries of Eastern Partnership, often issue is whether our revolution is geopolitical. It's a choice between West and East. And this is very false choice. I once talked to activists, not from Ukraine, but from another country, and they were trying to convince me that their revolution is not geopolitical. And then I asked, will you fight corruption? Yes, of course we will. So when you start fighting corruption, you are becoming geopolitical. When you fight corruption, you are immediately called by Russia geopolitical. When you fight the disinformation campaign or you protect media freedom, you are immediately becoming geopolitical, because it's not in interest of Russia to have a free debate, to have exchange of information, to have a truth-based information and media and journalism. So this can explain where EED see its role. We simply want to protect those values and give societies chances to pursue those values and protect them, not to be just geopolitical, because geopolitical today has no meaning in that sense, because we are talking only value-based societies, systems, or not value-based, or basically value-denied societies. Then second point is a general threat to democracy. We see trends that are present in mature democracies. These are not always part of hybrid type of threats, so we have to be aware also about them. Amplifying them is often caused by some deliberate actors, but they do exist and we have to be aware of it. And finally, organized society. In every country where revolution were more successful, we can easily measure that organized society, that the level people can organize themselves, is the best protection and the best weapon against hybrid and general threats to democracy. I will stop here because I'm sure you have many other questions.
Yes, thank you, Jerzy. I would like to ask you the following question. The other geopolitical aspect that we are currently discussing on different forums is actually the situation in Belarus. And this country was in attention of the international organizations, donors, for many years. Do you believe that the society can actually win the fight against the regime? And what is the difference between Ukraine and today's situation in Belarus?
Well, society always wins. Only question when and what price. And that is always the sad news, because there is a price to pay, like Roman Protasevich, like others are paying today, many hundreds of people in prisons, and those who are scared by aggressivity of Lukashenko. So, of course, society will win sooner or later, but it's not an optimistic. It is optimistic in a deep sense, but of course, it does not mean that there will be no sacrifices and price for it. So, from that point of view, I would like to simply bring back our memory before August 2020. Every seminar about Belarus among experts were ending up with the comment, well, Belarus is not like Ukraine, the society is apathetic, the people are in inertia, they are not willing to fight for change, they are having different state of mind, they are scared about Maidan and all happens in Ukraine. And then in August, everyone was surprised, even those scientists who were making those analyses. So society always surprises us. And that's why we at EED, we believe we should never stop. Whether general analysis and think tanks' opinions are saying no chances for change, no chances for new energy, let's keep working with the societies, because the energy is always there and the people will and believe in values is always there. We need to just help them. And in case of Belarus, we have this wonderful moment of awakening where people simply said, enough is enough. And I remember this beautiful picture in August when the old lady was crying in front of protesting young people and saying them, please forgive me that for so long I did nothing and now I'm joining you. A very senior 60 years old lady who remembers communism, who remembers Brezhnev and not just Lukashenko, how the young generation only remembers Lukashenko, or knows only Lukashenko. So I would say that the element of geopolitical dimension, of course, is there because I explain why. When you protect values, you automatically are geopolitical in this part of the world. But I would definitely say that in every society, there is a will and a dream of a better future. And one day, this dream coming true in a form of protest and then eventually of change.
Thank you so much for this introductive comments. Jerzy, I have a question to you, because your organization that we all praise and cherish for already so many years has actually this institutional memory. And I would, so you were acting and, well, not you personally, you're very young, but the organization was there to actually bring the light and the true news and truth from the West to the East. There were hopes with the collapse of the Soviet Union that now everywhere will have truth. And now we have a new phenomenon, which is disinformation. Would you say that disinformation is actually more dangerous than Soviet propaganda?
Thanks, Bogdana. It's great to be with you and my panelists. I do disinformation in its modern incarnation in many ways is even more dangerous than state-sponsored propaganda that we saw throughout Cold War from the communist regimes, from the Soviet Union and its client states. Part of that reason I feel it's even more dangerous right now is because our information environments are saturated more than ever than they were during the Cold War period. People are bombarded by information on a daily basis. And that, unfortunately, I think has given people the sense that they have ultimate choice over how they access information, over what types of information they can gain access to on a daily basis. But that's really a false sense of independence and freedom that is created in our societies, because we know that there are many interests behind the information that we are consuming on a daily basis. And that's the case even in the most advanced democracies like the United States or parts of Western Europe. And it's even more so the case than in democracies that are still struggling with the broader challenges that my fellow panelists have already described. Disinformation, ultimately, the information space, it makes it harder for people to have access to objective, unbiased information. And so in many cases, the work that Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty is doing across all of our 23 countries across Eurasia now, I'd say, is just as, if not even more important than the work we were doing during the Cold War, when people were drawn to us because they maybe had one other information source, state-run media outlets. Now people are drawn to us because, quite frankly, they feel lost and they're confused by all of the information that they're being bombarded with on a regular basis, and know they can turn it that is trusted, does not represent particular interest, that's editorially independent, that they know will present the truth and ultimately advance their broader interest, whether it's exposing corruption by private interests, whether it's highlighting mismanagement by the government that often frustrates them. They want to turn to outlets like Radio Europe, Radio Liberty to break through the disinformation conspiracy theories that they're receiving on a regular basis, especially as they go online to get information.
Jamie, I have a question then. Who is benefiting from disinformation? Who is financing? What is the aim behind?
Variety of actors. Certainly, I was struck by Oliver's discussion about kleptocracy and corruption, which ultimately, in part, is about self-preservation of the corrupt actors, especially when it's authoritarian regimes. And it's by they want to control. They want to control power. They want to control society, ultimately. So in many cases, you still have governments who have adapted the old tools, state-run propaganda, into a modern incarnation. Sometimes they can't get their citizens to actually consume information from outlets that are directly state-run, turn to disinformation, to cloud the information, make it harder for their citizens to objective information. Sometimes it's just private interests with a corporate agenda arcs. We see in many fledgling democracies that supporting the outlets sometimes to advance their own private interests, other times to support a political ally in the government. So it's a variety of different actors who benefit, unfortunately, from information domains where conspiracy theories, disinformation have really festered and created mass confusion about what is objective. And ultimately, it ends up corroding democracy. And again, we've seen this in fledgling democracies as well as some of the challenges that we have in places like the United States right now, where it makes political compromise much more difficult. It makes it difficult for society to function and for people to have an agreed set of facts upon which to base their political decision making.
Thank you. I would like to go back to Oliver, actually, with a question. So recently, in one of the reports, I've read that actually corruption can be healthy. Corruption, especially when it's in small doses, that it helps the society to accelerate. Do you agree with this statement? And at which level corruption becomes actually dangerous?
It's an interesting point. This has been a debate that's been going on for some decades now. Corruption is extremely healthy for corrupt people. As a rule, corrupt people benefit from corruption. Everyone else, however, does not. I think it's proven now beyond any kind of doubt that corruption is harmful to society and to society's development. And I'm going to explain why that is, because that might seem a little bit counterintuitive. If there is a bad rule, surely it's better to pay a bribe rather than go to court to face being punished under a bad rule. But essentially, the problem is that if anyone pays to get around bad rules, that means bad rules become profitable. And essentially, it is not only that there is no reason to get rid of them, but actually there's a reason to bring in new ones. I used to live in Moscow, and we used to joke quite regularly whenever new rules were brought in about traffic, that these essentially were brought in to replace pay rises for the police. I remember one winter when it became compulsory to have a clean car. Obviously, it's impossible to have a clean car when driving around Moscow, but essentially all it meant was that every single car could be targeted for a bribe from police officers, because everyone was essentially breaking the rules. No matter how carefully you drove, you were breaking the rules. So corruption becomes a revenue generating system for state officials, and then that money is passed up the pyramid of power. Each state official pays off their immediate superiors. So everyone is complicit, which then creates a second problem, which is that if everyone is complicit, if every state official, because their salaries are too small, they have to take bribes to supplement their salaries, then essentially everyone is guilty. So if any state official tries to stand up to corruption, they can be dismissed because they're corrupt. So corruption, it might seem in a small way to an individual paying a bribe that it's a harmless activity, that it's just a way of trying to get around an illogical rule. But you need to recognize that corruption never exists in isolation. No one bribe is paid in isolation. It's an entire system, a pyramid of power that is built up to essentially transform the state from a body to make its citizens' lives better into a body to essentially farm its citizens, to use them as a source of profit for public officials who are able to use the power entrusted in them, not for the benefit in which it's supposedly intended, but for the benefit of essentially profiting from it. Public officials become as profit centers. They then go not to the people best suited to holding them, but to the people who are most likely to pay large amounts to their superiors, who are able to maximize the profit available from those positions. So no, I think there was a sort of a debate, certainly back in the 1960s, that perhaps corruption was beneficial. It helped oil the wheels of capitalism and helped remove illogical obstacles in the path of business development. But I think it is now accepted as fact by pretty much any reputable researcher that corruption is only harmful. It does no good at all. It is much better to have rational rules and essentially allow them to be obeyed easily by everyone, rather than to pay bribes to get around irrational rules. I think it's really important to make that point quite clearly, because this idea that corruption can be beneficial is essentially only to the benefit of corrupt people. If you say corruption can be beneficial, then essentially it's just a way of saying let's not change anything. So no, I'm afraid I don't agree with you, essentially, in short.
Thank you, Oliver. Jerzy, coming back to your geopolitical scope, actually, of the discussion, Ukraine is often quoted as the Putin's laboratory of hybrid threat and hybrid warfare. So what is the role, according to you, of the civil society in this process? Is it the civil society who has to fight them, or the state, or all together? How do you see that?
That's a very good and unfortunately very difficult question. If we have a democratic state and we have authorities that we have elected, we do expect from them that they will protect us, not harass us, that they will invent solutions for the problems that we're facing. And this is a very legitimate claim. Unfortunately, weak democracies, weak states, or states under attack from different sides cannot always deliver on this. And definitely civil society in such a moment of weakness of state is best positioned and fastest and most sensitive to react. Media, independent media, journalists, and organized society, free organized society. And that is what we see in Ukraine. And that is what I saw after Maidan, where reanimation package reform group was preparing legal new laws to be voted by Rada. But that was a way the society was substituting certain functions of state. And if it is happening for 1, 2, 3, 4 years, it's good. But if it stays and continue, and the only fight against corruption relies on organized society, this is something wrong. And what we see today in Ukraine, and I must say that I'm not saying this with the pleasure, that this civil society that is so well organized is more and more harassed, not just by mafia or leaders, local mafia leaders who are afraid of being exposed, but also they are using the state system, prosecution, some kind of, tax control systems and others to harass civil society activists. And this is repeating, and this is now growing, and we are receiving many signals from the civil society that this situation is getting worse now in Ukraine than it was before. This is discredit, this is intimidate, this is threaten on personal basis, but using also state structures, prosecutors, local police, and that is very worrying signal. And here, civil society alone cannot fight it successfully back, because that shows that this level of state capture is growing, especially on this local levels. So here is a very strong warning signal, and I hope that Ukraine civil society, there are many new initiatives who are exposing this type of practices, that they will be given proper attention at the center of the country, at the president level, and they will find together a way to protect civil society, to do their job, to expose crime, to expose corruption, and to be protected by the state, not harassed.
Thank you, Jerzy. Jamie, a question to you, because Jerzy has mentioned about this, attacks on the civil society. Obviously, disinformation is also a part of these attacks. Would you say that we have some irreparable divisions within our society because of the disinformation? Has it built dividing lines between the countries as well as within the society? How do you see that?
Yeah, disinformation is used by political actors inside democracies to target the other side, to make it more difficult for their competitors to achieve certain objectives in that democracy. It's used especially by authoritarian regimes outside of their own borders. And we need to remember that like corruption, and the way that someone like Vladimir Putin has tried to use corruption and export corruption to advance Russia's security objectives, authoritarian regimes also export and have tested out these disinformation tools on their own societies to preserve their control of power. And they've also started to apply them in their neighborhood, initially in countries like Ukraine, using Ukraine as a testing ground for certain types of campaigns, which then they ended up, in the Russian case, applying to Western democracies in Western Europe and the US and elsewhere, as we've seen with democratic interference from Russia in recent years. We're starting to see China do some of that as well. So this problem never stays within the authoritarian regime's borders, but has clearly been exported. And part of that is not just the disinformation campaigns itself. We've seen a sustained effort from regimes like Russia to then target civil society groups who then are pushing back against these trends, and especially in the information space, targeting independent media. We see right now what Vladimir Putin is doing to independent media inside Russia, designating any independent media outlet that receives foreign assistance as a foreign agent, basically trying to blacklist those media outlets, including Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and our local entity, and trying to do this sort of thing in other countries, including Ukraine, where RFERL has had journalists actually detained in Donbass. We currently have a contributor who was in Crimea, Vladislav Yasipenko, picked up by the FSB, tortured, accused of being a spy. These are the sorts of tactics that we see authoritarian regimes use at home. And unfortunately, they've started to export them to other societies as well, including democracies, ultimately with the goal of driving out independent media outlets, making it easier for them to spread disinformation and to undermine citizens' trust in their government, and really set people against each other within those democratic societies, so that those societies cannot fully function, cannot thrive, and cannot pose a threat ultimately to the authoritarian neighbor.
Indeed. Going back to Jerzy. Jerzy, can the striving democracies in the East specifically do simultaneously what we have just discussed, fight the corruption, fight the hybrid threats, as well as building a democratic state, everything in the same moment? Is it doable?
Yes, it is. The answer is very simple, because there is no other choice. This is the only way they can succeed. So sequencing or excusing themselves because today we are at war, because this or that happens, then we will postpone one or another reform, judiciary, police, or other anti-oligarchic regulations, that is simply wrong. In the moment of change, in a moment of opportunity, we have to grasp the moment. We means the whole of the society, those who we elected and those who are electorate, who are sitting and demanding change. This has to all be done together and by the whole of the society. This is the only recipe to succeed. And you can have from the history many examples where countries were under war, under the pressure from not just one aggressor, but sometimes two, but they managed. And Ukraine can also manage. So in that sense, I strongly believe in the power of people in Ukraine. I strongly believe in a values that are shared by Ukrainian people. And I strongly still believe in a wisdom of those who are in the political positions, that they will not lose this opportunity. But at the same time, you're right. Those threats, those trends, mechanisms, they exist, those dramatic choices people have to make, these are all a very, very difficult conditions. But there is no other choice. Everything has to be done at the same time.
Can the West help?
Yes, West should help. And I hope it's helping, maybe not enough, but should. The West problem is, because I was saying some maybe not easy comments to the people in Ukraine about that civil society is not enough protected. I should say also same into our direction. Oliver is in London. How many, and you mentioned this, how many law firms in London are protecting interests of oligarchs? How many real estate companies became rich by selling properties across the Europe to the people who are operating with dirty money? We are not exposing this enough. I mean, not Oliver. Oliver is actually exposing, but we as a Western societies, we are not doing enough to expose. Why Yanukovych's own money in Raiffeisen Bank are safely hidden for so many years, and so on and so on. There is a lot to blame on us as well, but it is not excuse. It is just a joint effort to make sure that when we see the things, we react and we try to change it.
Interesting. Jamie, you have actually this helicopter view on 23 countries, but the question is the West apt actually to stop hybrid threats? Is it up to task?
I'm optimistic like Jerzy, but I think that it's a tall order and we're lagging behind in certain areas. I agree with everything Jerzy said about doing more, especially to counter those in the West who are supporting corruption. In the media space, I think we in countries like the United States and the European Union, we need to set a better example. When Western politicians, which is now routine in the United States, attack the media in the US, it becomes very difficult if you're in Ukraine or another country where RFERL operates, or Russia, to say that certain attacks on journalists are out of bounds, because it's a very thin line between criticizing journalists as fake news, or saying that they're a threat, or saying that they're not objective, to then the much more extreme types of harassment that we routinely see in many of the countries that RFERL operates in, physical threats, harassment by intelligence services. So I think in the media space, we can set a much better example. Obviously, as president of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, I'm a strong supporter of what the West can do in terms of supporting public media, both through funding, truly unbiased public broadcasters that provide local reporting in countries, in fledgling democracies that are trying to deal with all of these hybrid threats. I think it's also important that Western donor nations provide additional support to small fledgling outlets that are struggling, that are easily picked off by authoritarian regimes that want to clear out the information space and make it easier for disinformation to be successful. And so I think more financial support for those sorts of outlets and more willingness to by governments to speak out, to take a stand when they see journalists under attack. I think all of those things are already being done to varying extents by a number of governments, but I think those efforts can be expanded significantly so that we can truly rise up and help counter this challenge.
Thank you. Oliver, what would be your solution or advice to the West? How can they help?
Yeah, thanks for that. I'd really like to stress my support for what Jerzy was saying about the complicity of Western countries, Western institutions, Western individuals in corruption and the way that corruption is able to undermine democracy and spread disinformation. You can't be corrupt in a meaningful sense without the involvement of major Western institutions. Obviously, Jerzy mentioned Raiffeisen Bank, but sadly, Raiffeisen is very much not alone. Major banks from all across the European Union, and of course from the UK, as well as from other Western countries, have been complicit in moving and hiding wealth for corrupt elites for decades. We've seen that Western governments can be quite strict on these banks when their own interests are involved or the interests of their citizens, but they tend to be very laggardly when it comes to taking action to protect the interests of Eastern European countries. We saw this, it's particularly notable in the UK, as Jerzy mentioned, not just in the real estate sector, that's very important, but also in the shell company sector. The UK likes to offer its very cheap shell companies in order to help grow its economy, but these same shell companies are used by money launderers, have been used in Danske Bank, in Deutsche Bank, Swedbank. Any of the big money laundering scandals of recent times have been used by these same shell companies, and the government here has done precisely nothing about that. The same is true when it comes to misinformation. Obviously, a lot of misinformation is spread, created by governments or government-aligned entities, but then how does it spread further? It spreads obviously via Facebook, via Twitter, via the big Western tech companies. These can be quite proactive when it comes to trying to shut down misinformation in Western countries, such as, of course, the United States, as we've seen recently with its decision to ban the former president from Facebook for 2 years. But they're far, far less proactive when it comes to taking action to stop the spread of misinformation in Eastern European countries or Asian countries like Myanmar, and so on. So really, these countries need to be as forthright in defending democracy abroad as they are at home. And that's something that we all need to get onto them to force them through. I mean, essentially, it's very difficult to expect a country that has been corrupted for decades to be able to act to stop corruption on its own. It needs all the help that it can get. And for me, that means help from Western countries and Western institutions to make sure that our banks, our lawyers, our accountants, our media companies aren't undermining democracy in our allies. We can't profess to be good allies if our own institutions are undermining the values that we profess to support. And that's something that I think everyone in Western countries needs to get better at. I think we're quite good at lecturing foreign countries about improving their act, but not nearly good enough at improving our own act.
Thank you, Oliver. I have a question to three distinguished panelists, a quite personal one, because we are discussing now corruption, big money, defamation laws, disinformation, tortures, very, very difficult subjects. What personally motivates you every day to wake up and to start working and to continue doing amazing job that you are doing? Oliver, let's start with you.
Thanks. I mean, it's an interesting question. I worked for many years in the former Soviet Union. Some of my happiest years of my life were based in and around the former Soviet Union. And one of the reasons I first moved to Russia and then to Central Asia and elsewhere was because I really wanted to see democratic transformation. You know, I'd grown up during the Cold War, the dying days of the Cold War, and it really excited me, the prospect of seeing democracy sweeping across a whole half of the continent that had previously been denied it. And the years I've spent living in Russia mainly, but also elsewhere, I didn't really see democratic transformation. In fact, to be honest, I saw rather the opposite. I saw the return of authoritarianism and the gradual suffocation of what civil society had been able to appear. And I suppose for me, the realization, which happened largely after the Ukrainian Revolution in 2014, the Revolution of Dignity, that Western countries were complicit in suffocating democracy, that we had helped to encourage and support not the fighters for democracy, but rather the corrupt and authoritarian leaders by taking their money, by moving their money, by helping them raise funds and so on. To be honest, just disgusts me. It makes me very angry, the degree of hypocrisy involved. So I get up every day and I really hope that I'm going to sort of try and push back against that hypocrisy a bit. And if I can inconvenience some of the corrupt actors or their enablers, then it's a job I'm happy to do in a day well spent. So that's what motivates me. I like to think that, you know, while I'm here doing this, and fortunately I have lots of friends who do the same work, then it means it'd be maybe that little bit harder for corrupt people to be corrupt today.
Exactly. Jerzy, what's your recipe?
Well, I was lucky to live in interesting times. I had two such events in my life. One was when I was 19. It was the first visit of John Paul II to Poland after being elected the Pope. And we gathered together almost like, you know, maybe up to 1 million people in a big square in Warsaw. And at that moment, there was such a moment of feeling for the young person, 19 years old, that understood something about, you know, politics and history, but still very young, immature. But I felt this moment that here, in this moment, in this place, we are independent. No police, no Communist Party, and it was 1979, can come, can do something about us, that we are here just because of this one man with a certain message came. And that strength, that feeling of euphoria, this is something that accompanied all my life. And there was a second such a moment. It was the 4th June of 1989 when we had the first free election, partly actually free election in Poland. And it was a moment when really I felt the communism ends and we start new life for Poland. And that was, again, the same moment of euphoria, because I was much more mature. I understood it's real change. In just 2 years, 3 years before that, I wouldn't even believe that my son or daughter will enjoy a freedom of Poland. But it happens to me just now, and it's happening. And when you have such two moments in your life, I think it is a moral obligation to simply share it and do it, that everyone may have such a happy moment in their society, in their life. That's what motivates me.
Thank you. Jamie, what about you?
Somewhat similar to Jerzy, but from a different vantage point, watching from the US, I saw the events in particular of 1989 and the power of freedom. And so that has always inspired me in my career, and then especially at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, given that our journalists helped play a small role in providing the news and information that people were able to use then to take power into their own hands. And as president of RFERL, I repeatedly meet people who share their personal experiences with me about how important our work was for them, for their families. It's something that even as many of them are now quite older, remember with tears in their eyes, listening to our broadcasts and how that information that we were able to provide made them feel that they were powerful, that they had the ability to change their societies, and many of them went on to do that. And we've heard Lech Walesa, Václav Havel, and others speak to the importance that outlets like Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty played. The other thing that keeps me going on a daily basis at RFERL are our incredibly brave journalists. And I mentioned already Vladislav Yosipenko. Just 2 weeks ago, actually, in Kyiv, I was able to have dinner with 2 other journalists of ours who suffered immensely for their work. One, Stas Asayev, spent 2.5 years in Donetsk, detained by separatists in horrible conditions, and thankfully was eventually released. And his crime was trying to report on what was going on in Donetsk to his fellow citizens, and also to share information with Ukrainians elsewhere. Mykola Semena, who was detained under house detention in Crimea for several years, basically banned from doing journalism. And as he told me, he endured that period because it was his job. It was his job to report on what was going on in Crimea, despite the challenges of Russian occupation. And he stayed true to that mission throughout, and thankfully now is able to live freely in Kyiv. And then our colleague Ihar Losik, who's been detained for almost a year, a 29-year-old social media consultant for RFERL in Belarus, detained even before the August election, kept away from his wife and young daughter now for almost a year under, again, horrible circumstances. But he's staying true to his commitment and fighting, and we're fighting on his behalf to get him released. So all of those are just 3 individuals that keep me going on a daily basis right now. But RFERL, thankfully, has thousands of such journalists who are incredibly brave, who take great risks just to provide their fellow citizens with the truth on a daily basis.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank all the panelists, not only for your amazing contributions and for your ideas, which are very thought-provoking, not only for your recommendations, but also for your daily work, because you are examples of the democracy in action. So here we will conclude this panel, and we'll go now soon to the presidential panel. And let's hope that we are going to stay in great health, inspiration, and lots of enthusiasm to continue the wonderful work that you are all doing. Thank you very much.